Perhaps we've all heard about it and even experienced Murphy's Law, right? Let's all state it together. If anything can go wrong, it will. Do you have any experience with it? Is it true? Did you know that Murphy's Law was actually born on Edwards Air Force Base in 1949 and named for Captain Edward A. Murphy, an engineer working on an Air Force project? As he was finishing up a little part of the project, he noticed that a transducer was wired wrong, and he cursed the technician who had done the work and said, if there's any way to do it wrong, he'll find it. The contractor's project manager wrote down all the various laws that his project manager had enunciated over the years, and he called this one Murphy's Law. Shortly after that, an Air Force doctor who was also involved in the project gave a press conference, and he said that their good safety record on the project was due to a firm belief in Murphy's Law and the necessity to try and circumvent it. Soon, publications began to use the term Murphy's Law, and that's really how Murphy's Law developed. Well, that's a little bit of history, but if you think about it, many of us have had experience with it, don't we? Perhaps maybe your experience isn't exactly like this, but this humorous story sort of illustrates what Murphy's Law looks like. A man was on a camel, and he was riding miles through sun-drenched deserts, searching for some signs of life, and he really needed some water. His supplies were running low. Sadly, then, his camel died. Now he was on foot, and he was desperately seeking after refuge from the heat, and most importantly, a source of water. Suddenly, he came across a vendor in the middle of the desert. "Thank God I found you," the man cried. "Please help me. I'm in dire need of some water." "Well," said the vendor, "I don't have any water, but if you'd like, you can buy one of my neckties." "What am I going to do with a tie?" the man asked. "Well, that's what I'm selling. If you don't like it, I can't help you." The man was furious, and he left the vendor, and he walked for many more miles, praying each minute that he would find refuge from the scorching sun. His eyes began to water a bit, and he squinted a bunch of times, but he thought he could see a restaurant off in the distance. And not believing that a restaurant would be there in the middle of the desert, he thought it was mirage. But as he got closer and closer, sure enough, there was a restaurant right there in the middle of the desert. His mouth dropped open as he thought about the possibilities. And he walked up to the restaurant, but the doorman stopped him before he entered. He said, "Excuse me, but you can't come in here without a tie." There you go. That's Murphy's Law at work, isn't it? Some of you, just think a little bit more about it. You're still warming up. You'll get it about 5 minutes from now. How does Murphy's Law work itself out in your life? Maybe it's not, with refusing a necktie in the middle of a desert, but in some way, it seems like at times we think, this is going to happen, and then that happens, but then this happens. And that's kind of the way Murphy's Law works. Now, as we turn to a whole new sermon series in the new year, and we turn in our Bibles to Genesis 37, I want to suggest to you that in many ways the life of Joseph could be considered a case study in Murphy's Law. If anything could go wrong, it will. And Joseph, the life of Joseph in Genesis 37 through 50 is really in many ways a perfect summary. A perfect summary would be Murphy's Law. But I want to suggest to you today that as we look deeper into the life of Joseph, beginning today and over the next several weeks, that really it's not Murphy's Law that's at work, but it's God's rule. God's rule for those who will trust Him and rely upon Him. That's really the dynamic that we see in the life of Joseph. But from a surface perspective, it certainly seems like if anything can go wrong, it will in the life of Joseph. So as you've turned in your Bibles to Genesis 37, today I want to give just a very brief summary of the life of Joseph and sort of whet your appetite for what will follow as we think about this. This series is called Overcomer because in so many ways, Joseph is an overcomer. He had to overcome so many obstacles, so many barriers, so many instances of seemingly Murphy's Law at work in his life in order to experience what God had for him. And we could summarize Joseph's life, as the Bible does, in three broad segments. For his birth to 17 years, as covered by Genesis 37. And then 17 to 30 years, and that's covered by Genesis 39 through 40. And then the bulk of his life from 30 years till his death, which is covered by Genesis 41 through 50. And as we go through each part of Joseph's life, what we see over and over again is we keep asking ourselves, is this guy experiencing Murphy's Law or what? But as we go underneath the surface a little bit, we begin to see that no, actually it's not Murphy's Law, but it's God's rule that is at work in Joseph's life. Let's think a little bit about Joseph's life. First of all, in your Bible, in Genesis 37, we're introduced to this man, and we're introduced at a very high point of his life. And it's described this way: as the favored son of Jacob, Joseph was granted a richly ornamented robe. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, what that might be. But I want you to notice, as it's described in Genesis 37 in verse 2 and 3, that Joseph was a man of 17, and he was tending the flocks with his brothers. And he brought a bad report about them to his father. Now, his father had some issues of favoritism, and he favored Joseph, it says, more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe for him. He was the youngest, and yet he was given the privileges of the person who should have been the oldest, the person who should have received all the inheritance. He was given all the favors. You know what that did, of course? It created a low point in Joseph's life, because when his brothers saw that his father loved them more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a word to him. Here was an instance where Joseph received a high honor, and you think, wow, everything's going really well. And then Murphy's Law kicks in, and all of a sudden everyone hates him. Everyone around him hates him. He's now at a low point in his life, so much so that his brothers conspire against him. They conspire to kill him. But then at the last minute, they have a reprieve, and they decide to throw him into a pit and sell him to slave traders. Boy, you'd say he got a break. And it says in Genesis 37, verse 28, that finally when the Midian merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern, and they sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Think about Joseph's life. As it begins, he is honored as the most esteemed son of Jacob. And now he's headed off to Egypt. Certainly, Murphy's Law is at work in the life of Joseph. And what does it do? It leaves his father bitterly weeping over his son, inconsolable, it says in Genesis 37, verses 34 and 35. Jacob says, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. Now, if you were to stop following Joseph's life at this point, and you had every good reason to stop because you thought he was going to be sent off to Egypt and we'd never hear from him again. That's, of course, what the brothers thought. And that's what they told their father. He had died. We don't know what happened to him. He got eaten by a lion. They thought they would never, ever hear from him again. But as the period of Joseph's life continues from 17 to 30, we pick up the story now in Egypt. And in this next period of life that's covered from Genesis 39 through 40, we see that Joseph's life actually takes a turn, and he begins on a high note here in Genesis 39, verses 1 to 4. It says that Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the whole household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Man, if you think about it, how much had changed in Joseph's life. He had been taken out of a cistern. He had been carted off to Egypt, and we expected never to hear from him again, except he had been sold to exactly the right person who would now oversee his life, and he would rise up and become the chief attendant to one of the most powerful people in Egypt. Man, you can't picture a better ending to the story, right? Everything's going to go fine from this point. Joseph's going to wind up on his feet, and everything is going to be fine. What a rags to riches story. But wait, you said Murphy's Law. After refusing sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, because he wanted to do the right thing, because he did not want to violate his vows before God, and he did not want to offend and in any way violate the trust of his master, he is falsely accused of attacking Potiphar's wife. And it says that in the end, he is thrown into prison once again. Wow. Talk about how you can go from a high all the way to a low. He is framed and thrown in jail. What happens next? It can't go any lower, you would say. It can't go any lower, except it does. As it's described in Genesis 41, he's languishing in prison. And the only indication we have of the timing is it says sometime later. We don't know how long. Weeks, months, probably years. He's languishing in prison, and all of a sudden, Pharaoh gets upset with the cupbearer and the baker, and they wind up in the same prison as him. The chief cupbearer comes to him and says, I have a dream, and I'd like to know if you can interpret it for me. And Joseph correctly interprets it for him. He also correctly interprets the dream for the baker, and we'll get to that whole story in a few weeks. And lo and behold, the cupbearer is released from that prison, and Joseph has one wish for him. When you go back to Pharaoh, tell him about me. Tell him, don't forget me. But I want you to notice how that part of Joseph's life ended. It's as if Murphy's Law was completely at work. Genesis 41, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, the cupbearer had completely forgotten about Joseph. He languished in that jail, unjustly condemned to that jail, languishing, thinking, will anyone ever remember me? Until Pharaoh had a dream. Now the cupbearer remembers. Oh yeah, there was this guy who could interpret dreams, and maybe we should call him. And so begins the next and final phase of Joseph's life. He goes from that low point in jail now to a high point. As we see, he's able to correctly interpret the dream of Pharaoh, and he's put in charge of the whole land of Egypt because he can correctly foretell that there's going to be a period of 7 years of prosperous living followed by 7 years of famine. And he's able to help Pharaoh plan effectively for those 7 years of drought. And he's put in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And it says in verse 46 of Genesis 41 that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph was, in essence, the prime minister of the land. He was the assistant in charge, the executive of the king. He was sent throughout the land, it says throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in the land. Imagine this. Joseph goes from being in a pit, in a cistern in Cana, to becoming Potiphar's chief assistant, to going back to prison, to be raised up once again to become prime minister. Oh, what a story, all in the first 30 years of his life. And you would say, wow, what an amazing turnaround. Perhaps now he's never again ever going to have to experience Murphy's Law again. In fact, it goes so well for Joseph that it says that he marries and has 2 children. Genesis 41, verses 50 and 52 describes that great high point of Joseph's life this way. He was married to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, and Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh. And notice why he called his firstborn Manasseh. It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Perhaps in Joseph's mind he thought, never again will I have to experience all the hardships that I've encountered. I am now set for life. His second child was named Ephraim, and he called his son Ephraim because, as he says there in verse 52, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Never again. I'm set for life. Will I have to experience these kinds of hardships again? But then it seems that once again, Murphy's Law rears its ugly head. And in this time, it's not an external trial that Joseph is going to face in this season of his life. He continues to be the prime minister, but now there's going to be an internal battle that he goes through. Because what happens while he's the prime minister, his brothers show up. And it says in Genesis 42 that Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. Now all of a sudden, Joseph has to deal with stuff in his life that he had perhaps put aside, had tried to forget. Now he begins to have to deal with relationship issues and family dysfunction and so many things that he has to learn to overcome now as he's standing at the pinnacle of success. Emotionally, he's brought back to infancy and has to learn to cope with so many difficult things in his life. He is brought to another low point of his life. At one point, he is brought to tears over all that has gone on and the loss of his father who believes that he has been dead all these years. In the end, the story does turn out pretty well, doesn't it? As Joseph eventually, through a series of maneuvers, is able to convince his brothers to bring his father and his youngest brother back, and eventually the whole family is reunited, as we see in Genesis 47. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land. And so everything settles in, the family settles in Egypt once and for all. Now, as we look at Joseph's life in that brief summary, we're going to dive into specific elements of Joseph's life over the course of the next several weeks. As you think about it, and you think about Joseph as an overcomer, I would suggest to you that there are a number of ways in which Joseph experienced being an overcomer. But one of the ways that we have to understand all of this happening in Joseph's life is that as Joseph was going through all of this, the highs and the lows, one thing was constant. It's described, and it's the exact phrase in Genesis 39, verses 2 and 3, verses 20 and 23. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord gave him success in whatever he did. Whether Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt, or whether he was in jail, in Potiphar's jail, both times it's described that the Lord was with Joseph. The key to experiencing this overcoming as we go through the lows of life and we go through the highs of life is to know that God is at work in our lives. You see, I believe that God works in our lives, in every facet of our lives if we're a believer. It's not Murphy's Law. If something happens in our lives, it's not Murphy's Law. We shouldn't curse the circumstances that have happened in our lives. We should look for evidence that God is at work, that God is working in us. The Lord was with, put your name in there, and the Lord granted success in whatever you did. God can be at work in our circumstances, and God is at work in the life of a believer, in the lows and in the highs. And I hope that in this year of 2018 that we'll learn to see God at work in each and every circumstance of our lives, and understand that although from the surface it might look at like Murphy's Law has wreaked its havoc again. No, I can't believe that this person got it and I didn't. I can't believe that I missed out on this. I can't believe that the doctor said this and that. That we can learn to see that God is at work in the life of believers. In fact, Joseph expressed that confidence to his brothers, and he made it clear that he believed that in the end, God was always at work in his life, even in the lowest point in the pit, and even at the highest point when he was prime minister. Here's what Joseph said to his brothers. When his brothers found out that Joseph was who he was, his brother that they had sold into slavery, he says to them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And so now do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." He repeats that same phrase again. God made me. God sent me ahead of you. You see, Joseph expresses a firm belief in a God who is at work in every circumstance of our lives. And every one of us has a choice, especially as we start the new year. Will we look at our lives through the lens of Murphy's Law and think, "Oh boy, it happened again"? This morning we were getting ready for worship, and something happened with the PowerPoint presentation, and it completely went away. And we were scrambling to try and get it back. And I just said, well, that's because I'm preaching on Murphy's Law. But God was at work, and somehow we were able to do a backup, and we were saved the day, and I'm sure you guys are glad. But you can look at little things like that, and you can kind of curse it and say, once again, Murphy's Law at work. Or you can say, maybe God's trying to teach me something in this. Maybe God's at work. Maybe God sent me ahead. Maybe God is placing me in a different position, in a different place. And so we have to learn, like Joseph, to be freed from that vicious cycle of Murphy's Law by learning to trust God. Perhaps the most familiar verse as we get to the end of the story of Joseph that all of us have heard before is Joseph's declaration in Genesis 50. And he says this again to the brothers: "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." I wonder if you and I can say that honestly today. Can you honestly say, am I in the place of God? Or are you saying, I want to be somewhere else? A lot of us want to be somewhere else. Part of the challenge of walking through the life of Joseph in 2018 is to learn to say, I am in the place, Lord, that you have put me, and you're intending it for good. There is a verse in the New Testament that reminds us that God is always at work in the life of a believer for good. And it's found in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And it says, "For we know that in all things, in the low points of our lives, in the high point of our lives, and everywhere in between, whether we think it's Murphy's Law or we understand it's God's rule, in all things," it says, "God works." Just think about that for a second. God works. He works for the good. What does that mean? It certainly doesn't mean that everything that happens in our life is good. Health challenges, financial hurdles, those things aren't good in themselves. But God is at work for the good. And the good is to bring about maturity and growth and bring us closer to Him. And so God is at work in all the circumstances of our lives. But far too often, we want those circumstances to be removed. We want them to be eliminated. God says, I'm at work. I'm at work in the midst of it for the good. And then Paul can say in verse 37, in all things, again he uses that same phrase, in all things we are more than conquerors. He doesn't mean that means everything's going to go great. He means that in the midst of it, we can overcome. We can experience God's fullness. We can experience God's joy in the midst of all of these things. That's what I believe Joseph experienced most of all in his life. He learned to be an overcomer because he learned in the midst of all things to recognize that God was working in his life to develop character in him, to fashion him and form him into the person that he ultimately became. That shepherd boy in Cana was not ready to be the prime minister of Egypt. But through the course of his crucible of suffering, he was prepared and shaped and molded to become the prime minister of Egypt. And God is at work in our lives. Do you believe that in 2018 God is at work in your life? Can you trust Him to be at work in your life through all the circumstances? Over the next several weeks, we're going to be looking at the various ways in which Joseph overcame various hurdles in his life. Those are real. We're not going to minimize them. But in the midst of them, we're going to say, is God at work? Can I trust Him? Can I rely upon Him?